The scorching Arizona sun cast long shadows across the desolate landscape as Jake Loner Mackenzie guided his weathered horse, Thunder, up the familiar ridge that overlooked what had once been his family's ranch. The year was 1886, and after 5 years of wandering the frontier, he was finally coming home to Tombstone territory. But what greeted him stopped his heart cold. "Hi, how are you? Sorry to interrupt your story, but what I'm going to ask you is really quick and it will really help the channel to grow and create new stories. Just click below the video image to subscribe. You'll be doing an act of kindness and encouragement to those who are just starting out. Thank you very much and continue with your story now." Where the Mackenzie homestead had stood for over 2 decades, only charred ruins and blackened stone remained. The white farmhouse was gone, reduced to ash and memories. The barn had collapsed into itself, and an unnatural silence hung over the land like a burial shroud. Jake dismounted slowly, his spurs jingling in the eerie quiet. At 44 years old, he'd seen enough destruction to last several lifetimes. But this was personal. This was the place where he'd been born, where his younger brother Samuel had taken his first steps, where their parents had built a life from nothing. "Easy, boy," he whispered to Thunder, who was snorting nervously at the smell of old smoke and something else, something that made Jake's skin crawl. As he walked through the debris, Jake's trained eye picked up details that told a story of violence. This hadn't been an accident. The burn patterns were too deliberate, too thorough. Someone had wanted to erase every trace of the Mackenzie family from this earth. He made his way to what remained of the stone fireplace, the only structure still partially standing. Something caught his attention, a loose stone, slightly askew from the others. His calloused fingers worked it free, revealing a small cavity behind it. Inside was a scorched leather pouch. With trembling hands, Jake opened it to find a hand-drawn map on yellowed paper. The ink was faded but legible, showing landmarks he recognized. Devil's Canyon, the old mining settlement of Copper Creek, and strange symbols he'd never seen before. At the bottom, in his brother Samuel's distinctive handwriting, were the initials SM and a date, April 12th, 1886, just 2 months ago. "Samuel," Jake breathed, his heart pounding. His younger brother had been presumed dead for over a year, killed in a mining accident in Colorado. Yet here was proof he'd been alive, and here, just weeks ago. A child's terrified scream shattered the silence, causing Jake to spin around, his hand instinctively moving to his Colt .45. The sound came again, weak, desperate, coming from the direction of the old root cellar behind where the house had stood. Jake approached cautiously, following the sound to a partially collapsed wooden door. He pulled it open to reveal a small girl, maybe 7 years old, huddled in the corner like a frightened animal. Her dress was torn and filthy, her face streaked with tears and soot. She looked up at him with wide, terrified brown eyes. "Please don't hurt me, mister," she whispered, pressing herself further into the corner. "I ain't got nothing left to take." Jake holstered his weapon and knelt down, making himself less threatening. "I'm not going to hurt you, little one. My name's Jake Mackenzie. This was my family's ranch. What's your name?" Molly," she stammered. "Molly Patterson. My pa worked for your family before they came." "Who came, Molly? Who did this?" Fresh tears spilled down her dirt-streaked cheeks. "Bad men. They came 3 days ago looking for something. They kept asking about Samuel Mackenzie, said he had something that belonged to them. When my pa said he didn't know nothing, She couldn't finish, but Jake understood. "Where's your pa now, Molly?" "They took him. Said they needed him to help find the other pieces. They burned everything and took him away." She pointed a shaking finger toward the ruins. "I hid down here when I heard them coming back. Been too scared to come out." Jake's jaw tightened. Whoever had done this was looking for the same map he now carried in his pocket, and they had taken an innocent man to help them find more. "Molly, I need you to tell me everything you remember about these men. Can you do that for me?" The girl nodded, wiping her nose on her sleeve. "There were 5 of them. The leader, he had a gold tooth right here." She pointed to her front teeth. "He kept talking about pieces of a puzzle, Said Samuel Mackenzie thought he was clever hiding them all over creation. Did they say anything about where they were going? Molly's face scrunched up in concentration. The gold-tooth man, he said something about heading to Copper Creek first, then to some place called Widow's Peak. Said they'd get their answers there, one way or another. Copper Creek. Jake knew the abandoned mining town well. A day's hard ride north through treacherous canyon country. If these men had taken Molly's father there, the man was in serious danger. Jake stood up and extended his hand to Molly. Come on, little one. We're getting you out of here. Where are we going? She asked, taking his hand with surprising trust. First, we're going to get you cleaned up and fed. Then we're going to find your pa and make the men who did this pay for what they've done. As they walked toward Thunder, Molly tugged on his sleeve. Mr. Jake? The gold-tooth man. He said something else. He said Samuel Mackenzie wasn't as dead as folks thought, and when they found him, they'd make him wish he'd stayed buried. Jake stopped walking. Samuel's alive? That's what they said. Said he was hiding somewhere, but they'd flush him out using the pieces of his map. Jake looked down at the brave little girl who'd survived 3 days alone in a burned-out cellar and felt something stir in his chest that he hadn't felt in years. Purpose. Not just the need for answers about his family, but the responsibility to protect someone who couldn't protect themselves. He lifted Molly onto Thunder's saddle and swung up behind her. Molly, I want you to know something. I'm going to find your father, and I'm going to find my brother, and I'm going to make sure the men who destroyed our homes pay for every bit of pain they've caused. That's a promise. As they rode away from the ruins of his childhood home, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The map in his pocket felt like it was burning a hole through the leather, and Samuel's mysterious survival raised more questions than answers. But one thing was certain. Whoever had destroyed his family's ranch and taken Molly's father had made a fatal mistake. They'd left a witness alive, and they'd awakened something in Jake Mackenzie that had been sleeping for far too long. The hunt was about to begin, and this time, the loner wouldn't be riding alone. The morning sun painted the Arizona mountains in shades of gold and crimson as Jake and Molly made their way through the winding canyon trail toward Copper Creek. The abandoned mining town lay nestled in a valley between two towering mesas, accessible only through a narrow pass that had claimed more than its share of unwary travelers over the years. Molly had proven to be a resilient traveling companion, her initial terror giving way to a fierce determination that reminded Jake of himself at that age. She rode behind him on Thunder, her small arms wrapped around his waist, occasionally pointing out landmarks she remembered from trips with her father. Pa used to bring supplies to the miners up there, she said, gesturing toward the rocky outcroppings ahead. Said Copper Creek was cursed, though. Too many good men died in those tunnels. Jake nodded grimly. He'd heard the stories, too. Cave-ins, gas explosions, and worse. But if the men who'd taken Molly's father were using the old mining town as a base, they'd chosen their location well. It was isolated, defensible, and far from any law enforcement. As they crested a ridge overlooking the valley, Jake pulled Thunder to a halt and reached for his spyglass. Through the lens, he could see the skeletal remains of Copper Creek spread out below, weathered buildings, rusted mining equipment, and the dark mouths of abandoned tunnels scarring the mountainside. There, Molly whispered, pointing to a thin column of smoke rising from one of the larger buildings. Someone's there. Jake adjusted the focus and felt his blood run cold. 5 horses were tethered outside what had once been the town's saloon, and he could see movement in the windows. But what made his heart race was the figure tied to a post in the town's main street, a middle-aged man in work clothes who could only be Molly's father. Is that him? Jake asked softly. Molly squinted down at the distant figure. Pa! She gasped, starting to slide down from the horse. Jake caught her arm gently but firmly. Easy, little one. We can't just ride down there. Those men will kill us both before we get halfway to town. But we can't just leave him there. We won't. But we need to be smart about this. Jake studied the terrain, his military experience from the Apache Wars kicking in. There's an old mining trail that comes down the backside of the mountain. If I can get close enough, I might be able to create a distraction. What kind of distraction? Jake pointed to a series of wooden supports holding up the entrance to one of the larger mines. Those timbers look pretty rotten. A few well-placed shots might bring down enough rock to get their attention. As they made their way around the valley to the back trail, Molly suddenly grabbed Jake's arm. "Mr. Jake, look!" Following her gaze, Jake saw a lone rider approaching Copper Creek from the east. Even at this distance, there was something familiar about the man's posture, the way he sat his horse. Jake raised the spyglass again and nearly dropped it in shock. The rider was Samuel Mackenzie. His younger brother looked older, thinner, with a beard that hadn't been there when Jake had last seen him. But there was no mistaking those features, that distinctive way of tilting his head when he was thinking. Samuel was alive, and he was riding straight into a trap. "We have to warn him," Jake muttered. But even as he spoke, he knew it was too late. Samuel was already entering the town, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. Through the spyglass, Jake watched as the 5 men emerged from the saloon. The leader, a tall man with a distinctive gold tooth that glinted in the sunlight, stepped forward to greet Samuel. Even from this distance, Jake could see the tension in the confrontation. "Who is that?" Molly asked. "My brother, the one they thought was dead." Jake's mind raced. Why would Samuel walk into an obvious trap? Unless he had a plan. The answer came a moment later when Jake spotted movement on the ridge opposite their position. 3 more riders were working their way down toward the town, moving with the practiced stealth of men who knew how to use terrain to their advantage. Samuel hadn't come alone. "Molly, I need you to stay here with Thunder. No matter what happens down there, you don't move from this spot unless I come back for you. Understand? Where are you going?" "To help my brother save your father." Jake checked his weapons, his Colt .45, the Winchester rifle, and the knife in his boot. "If I'm not back by sunset, you ride hard for Tombstone and find Sheriff Bean. Tell him everything." Jake made his way down the treacherous back trail, using every bit of cover the rocky terrain provided. As he got closer to the town, he could hear voices carrying on the desert air. "Told you I'd come alone, Garrison," Samuel was saying. "Now let the girl's father go. Not until you tell us where the rest of the maps are hidden," came the reply in a voice rough with tobacco and whiskey. "We found one piece at your family's ranch, but we know there are at least 3 more. The maps are worthless without the key," Samuel replied. "And I'm the only one who knows how to read them." Jake crept closer, positioning himself behind an overturned ore cart about 50 yards from the main street. From here, he could see the confrontation clearly. Samuel stood in the center of the street, hands at his sides, facing 5 armed men. Molly's father was tied to a post about 20 feet away, conscious but clearly beaten. "Then you'll read them for us," Garrison said, his gold tooth catching the light as he smiled. "Right after you watch us put a bullet in this man's head." "Wait," Samuel said quickly. "I'll tell you what you want to know. But first, I want to know who you're working for. This isn't about the gold, is it? Someone wants revenge." Garrison laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the canyon walls. "Smart man. Yeah, this is about more than treasure. Our employer has a personal interest in the Mackenzie family. Seems your brother Jake killed his son a few years back." Jake's blood turned to ice. He'd killed several men in self-defense over the years, but only one death had haunted him. A young hothead named Diego Castellanos, who'd forced a gunfight in Santa Fe. The boy's father, Victor Castellanos, was one of the most powerful and ruthless men in the Southwest. "Castellanos," Samuel said, and Jake could hear the resignation in his brother's voice. "I should have known. He wants both Mackenzie brothers to suffer before they die. Your fake death in the mine bought you some time, but not much. And now that Jake's back," Garrison shrugged. "Well, let's just say this is going to be a family reunion." That's when Jake realized the truth. This had all been a trap, not just for Samuel, but for him. They'd burned the ranch knowing he'd eventually return. They'd left the map knowing he'd find it. They'd taken Molly's father knowing Jake would feel compelled to rescue him. But if they thought they were dealing with the same man who'd left Arizona 5 years ago, they were about to learn how wrong they were. The frontier had a way of hardening a man, and Jake Mackenzie had become something more dangerous than they could imagine. He raised his Winchester and took careful aim at the rope holding Molly's father to the post. One shot to free the hostage, then all hell would break loose. But just as his finger tightened on the trigger, a new voice called out from the ridge above. "That's far enough, Garrison." Jake looked up to see a woman standing on the rocky outcropping, a rifle trained on the men below. She was young, maybe 25, with long dark hair and the kind of confidence that came from knowing how to handle herself in dangerous situations. "Well, well," Garrison called back. "If it isn't the famous Elena Vasquez, come to rescue your boyfriend, have you?" Samuel's girlfriend. Jake filed that information away as the situation became even more complicated. But complicated or not, it was time to act. The first shot rang out across Copper Creek, and the final confrontation began. The gunfight erupted like thunder in the narrow canyon as Jake's rifle shot severed the rope binding Molly's father to the post. The man rolled behind a water trough just as Garrison's men opened fire, their bullets splintering wood and ricocheting off stone. From her position on the ridge, Elena Vasquez laid down covering fire with deadly precision, her shots forcing two of Garrison's men to dive for cover behind an overturned wagon. Samuel used the chaos to draw his own weapon, a modified Colt that Jake didn't recognize. "Jake!" Samuel shouted over the gunfire, spotting his brother's position behind the ore cart. "The mine shaft! There's something you need to see!" Jake put 3 quick shots into the saloon's front window, driving back a gunman who was trying to get an angle on Samuel. "Kinda busy right now, little brother." But Samuel was already moving, using the confusion to dash toward the largest mine entrance. Garrison saw him go and cursed, barking orders at his remaining men. "Don't let him reach the mine. Whatever's in there, it's worth more than all our lives." Jake realized that Samuel wasn't just seeking cover. He was leading them somewhere specific. The mine held answers, and his brother was willing to risk everything to reach it. A bullet whined past Jake's ear, and he turned to see one of Garrison's men flanking his position. Jake's Colt barked twice, and the man went down. But the distraction cost him. Garrison himself was now advancing on Samuel's position, his own rifle raised. "Elena," Jake called out. "Garrison!" The woman on the ridge swung her rifle around, but she was too far away for a clear shot. Garrison was almost to the mine entrance, and Samuel was trapped inside. That's when Molly's father proved he was tougher than he looked. Despite his injuries, the man had crawled to where one of the fallen gunmen had dropped his weapon. He rose up behind Garrison, just as the gold-toothed leader reached the mine entrance. "Hey, you son of a bitch!" Garrison spun around, and Molly's father put a bullet in his shoulder, spinning him around and sending his rifle flying. But Garrison was far from finished. He drew his sidearm with his good hand and returned fire, the shot echoing through the canyon. Jake saw Molly's father stagger and fall, clutching his leg. Rage filled him like molten metal, and he broke from cover, charging across the open ground toward Garrison. The remaining gunmen tried to stop him, but Elena's covering fire kept them pinned down. Garrison saw him coming and smiled, his gold tooth glinting. "Jake Mackenzie, just the man I wanted to see. Your brother's been telling me all about the family business." "Let him go, Garrison. This is between you and me." "Oh, but it's so much more than that." Garrison backed toward the mine entrance, his gun trained on Jake. "You see, your brother found something in these mountains that changes everything. Something that makes the Valdez treasure look like pocket change." Jake kept advancing, his Colt steady in his hand. "What are you talking about?" "Why don't you ask him yourself?" Samuel emerged from the mine shaft, but he wasn't alone. A small figure walked beside him. A boy, maybe 10 years old, with the same dark hair and green eyes as the Mackenzie brothers. Jake's world tilted on its axis. "Samuel, who is that?" "His name is Thomas," Samuel said quietly. "He's your son, Jake." The words hit Jake like a physical blow. His son? But that was impossible. He'd never, except there had been that woman in Santa Fe, Maria Castellanos, Diego's sister. They'd had a brief relationship before the gunfight that changed everything. "Maria's boy," Jake whispered, understanding flooding through him. "She died giving birth," Samuel continued, his voice heavy with emotion. "But not before she made me promise to protect him, to keep him safe from her father's revenge." Garrison laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Touching family reunion. But you see, Jake, Victor Castellanos doesn't just want you dead. He wants to destroy everything you care about, starting with the boy. Jake's hand tightened on his gun. You're not touching him. Oh, but I am. You see, the boy is the key to everything. The real treasure isn't gold, Jake. It's information. Documents hidden in these mines that could destroy some very powerful people. And your son is the only one who knows where they are. Thomas stepped forward, his young face showing a courage that reminded Jake painfully of himself at that age. I won't tell you anything. My mama said you were bad men. Your mama was a traitor, Garrison snarled. She stole those documents from her own father and hid them to protect you. But now Daddy's come home, and it's time to set things right. Jake's mind raced as the pieces fell into place. Maria hadn't just been Diego's sister. She'd been working against her father, trying to expose his criminal empire. And she'd used the old Spanish mine as a hiding place for evidence that could bring down Victor Castellanos and his organization. The maps, Jake said suddenly, they don't lead to treasure. They lead to the evidence. Samuel nodded grimly. Maria divided the location into pieces, just like the old treasure hunters used to do. But instead of hiding gold, she was hiding the truth about her father's crimes. Murder, extortion, corruption. Enough to put him away forever. And now the boy remembers where she hid it all, Garrison said. Funny how children remember the strangest things. A game his mother played with him, hiding things in special places. He just doesn't know what he knows yet. Jake looked at his son, and saw the confusion and fear in those green eyes. The boy was trying to be brave, but he was just a child caught in a web of adult violence and betrayal. Thomas, Jake said gently, holstering his weapon and kneeling down. I'm your father. I know this is confusing, but I need you to trust me. Can you do that? The boy studied his face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Mama showed me pictures. She said you were a good man who made a mistake. She was right about both things. Jake stood up, his resolve hardening. Garrison, here's what's going to happen. You're going to let my son and my brother walk away. Then you and I are going to settle this like men. I don't think so. Garrison raised his gun toward Thomas. The boy comes with me. Castellanos wants to meet his grandson before he decides what to do with him. That's when Elena Vasquez proved why she had a reputation as one of the deadliest shots in the territory. Her rifle cracked from the ridge, and Garrison's gun flew from his hand, his fingers mangled by the precisely placed bullet. Jake didn't waste the opportunity. He lunged forward, tackling Garrison to the ground. The two men rolled in the dust, fighting for control of Jake's weapon. Garrison was younger and desperate, but Jake had years of hard living and the fury of a father protecting his child. The fight ended when Jake managed to get his hands around Garrison's throat. Where's Castellanos? He demanded. Go to hell, Garrison gasped. You first. Jake's hands tightened, and Garrison's struggles grew weaker. Jake, don't! Samuel's voice cut through the red haze of rage. We need him alive. He's the only one who knows where Castellanos is hiding. Jake looked up to see his brother and son watching him, and slowly released his grip. Garrison collapsed, unconscious but breathing. As the dust settled over Copper Creek, Jake finally had a chance to really look at his son. Thomas was small for his age, with intelligent eyes and a serious expression that reminded Jake of Samuel as a boy. But there was something else there, too. A strength that came from surviving in a world that had tried to destroy him. Are you really my papa? Thomas asked quietly. Jake knelt down again, his heart breaking at the hope and uncertainty in the boy's voice. Yes, son, I am. And I'm never going to let anyone hurt you again. But even as he made the promise, Jake knew that Victor Castellanos was still out there, still hunting them. The evidence Maria had hidden might be the key to stopping him, but first they had to find it. And they were running out of time. 3 days after the shootout at Copper Creek, Jake sat around a small campfire with his newfound family, studying the maps Samuel had collected. They'd made camp in a hidden canyon about 20 miles south of Tombstone, a place Samuel knew from his mining days. Molly's father, Patterson, was recovering from his leg wound, while Elena kept watch from the canyon rim. Thomas sat close to Jake, his small hand occasionally reaching out to touch his father's arm, as if to reassure himself that this wasn't all a dream. The boy had been remarkably resilient, but Jake could see the trauma lurking behind those brave green eyes. "Tell me about the game your mama played with you," Jake said gently, spreading the maps out on a flat rock. "The one where she hid things in special places." Thomas's face brightened slightly. "Mama called it treasure hunting. She'd hide little things around our house in Santa Fe, then draw pictures to help me find them. But the last time we played, she said it was different. She said this treasure was real, and someday someone would need me to remember where it was." Samuel leaned forward. "What kind of pictures did she draw, Thomas?" The boy studied the maps carefully, his finger tracing the various symbols and landmarks. "These look like her pictures, but bigger. See this?" He pointed to a symbol that looked like a cross with a circle around it. "Mama drew this on the wall of the old church. She said it meant safe place." Jake's pulse quickened. "What church, son?" "The one in the ghost town. The place where the Spanish soldiers used to pray before they went looking for gold." Thomas looked up at his father. "Mama said the Spanish were good at hiding things, but not as good as she was." Elena called down from the rim. "Riders coming. Looks like a dozen men, maybe more." Jake was on his feet instantly, his hand moving to his gun. "Castellanos?" "Has to be," Samuel said grimly. "Garrison must have told him where to find us." But as the riders drew closer, Jake realized something was wrong. These weren't the kind of men Castellanos usually employed. They wore badges, and their leader was a tall man with a distinctive white mustache. "That's Sheriff Behan from Tombstone," Patterson said, squinting at the approaching group. "What's he doing out here?" The answer came when the riders entered the canyon. Sheriff Behan dismounted, but he wasn't alone. Behind him rode a man Jake recognized from wanted posters. Victor Castellanos himself, flanked by a dozen heavily armed men. "Well, well," Castellanos said, his cultured voice echoing off the canyon walls. "The Mackenzie family reunion. How touching." Jake stepped protectively in, front of Thomas, his hand resting on his gun butt. "Castellanos, I was wondering when you'd show yourself. I thought it was time we met face to face. After all, you killed my son, and now I discover you have a son of your own." Castellanos' cold blue eyes fixed on Thomas. "The irony is delicious." "What's the sheriff doing with you?" Jake demanded. Behan looked uncomfortable but determined. "Mr. Castellanos has convinced me that you and your brother are wanted for questioning in connection with several murders and robberies. I'm here to bring you in." "That's a lie, and you know it," Samuel said angrily. "Is it?" Castellanos smiled coldly. "Sheriff, perhaps you'd like to see the evidence I've prepared. Bank robbery in Tucson, murder of a federal marshal in Phoenix, cattle rustling near Prescott. The Mackenzie brothers have been very busy." Jake realized what was happening. Castellanos had bought the sheriff, or at least convinced him with forged evidence. Either way, they were trapped. "Papa," Thomas whispered, tugging on Jake's sleeve. "I remember where Mama hid the real treasure, the papers that prove the bad man is lying." Castellanos heard him, and his eyes glittered with avarice. "Ah, the boy remembers. How convenient. Thomas, why don't you tell your grandfather where your mother hid those documents?" "You're not my grandfather," Thomas said with surprising firmness. "Mama said you were a bad man who hurt people. Your mother was a traitor who stole from her own family." Castellanos snarled, his cultured mask slipping. "But you're going to make up for her betrayal. You're going to tell me where she hid those papers, or I'm going to start killing people you care about." Jake's hand moved to his gun, but Castellanos' men already had their weapons drawn. They were outnumbered and outgunned, with nowhere to run in the narrow canyon. "The old Spanish mission," Thomas said suddenly. "That's where Mama hid everything, in the place where the cross meets the circle." Castellanos smiled triumphantly. "I knew you were a smart boy. Sheriff, we'll be taking the child with us. As for the Mackenzie brothers—" "Wait," Elena called from the canyon rim. "Before you do anything you'll regret, you might want to see this." She held up a leather satchel, waving it so everyone could see. Maria Castellanos was very thorough. She didn't just hide one set of documents. She made copies and hid them in multiple locations. This satchel contains enough evidence to hang you, Victor. Murder, extortion, bribery of federal officials. It's all here. Castellanos' face went white. That's impossible. Maria only had access to a few documents. Your daughter was smarter than you gave her credit for, Elena continued. She spent months copying everything she could find. Financial records, correspondence with corrupt officials, even confessions from men you had killed. She was building a case against you. You're bluffing, Castellanos said, but Jake could hear the uncertainty in his voice. Elena opened the satchel and began reading. Letter dated March 15, 1885, from Victor Castellanos to Judge Morrison in Phoenix. The Mackenzie. Problem must be resolved permanently. I'm prepared to pay $50,000 for a conviction on any charges you deem appropriate. Sheriff Bayan's face went pale. Judge Morrison? But he's the one who issued the warrants for the Mackenzie brothers. All forged, Elena said, along with the evidence. Victor Castellanos has been using the legal system to hunt down the family of the man who killed his son, and he's been paying officials like you to help him do it. Jake saw his chance. While Castellanos was distracted by Elena's revelations, he drew his gun and put it to the man's head. Sheriff, I think you need to reconsider who the real criminal is here. Bayan looked around uncertainly, clearly realizing he'd been played. Mr. Castellanos, if what this woman says is true— It's all lies, Castellanos snarled. Don't listen to them. Then you won't mind if we ride back to Tombstone and let a federal judge sort this out, Jake said. Along with all the evidence Maria gathered, Thomas stepped forward, his young voice clear and strong. My mama wasn't a traitor. She was trying to stop you from hurting more people. She told me that good people have to stand up to bad people, even when it's scary. Looking at his son, Jake felt a surge of pride. The boy had inherited more than just the Mackenzie eyes. He had the Mackenzie courage, too. Sheriff, Jake said, I'm placing Victor Castellanos under citizen's arrest for conspiracy, murder, and corruption of federal officials. The evidence is all there in that satchel. Bayan hesitated for a moment, then nodded slowly. Mr. Castellanos, I'm afraid you'll have to come with me. We need to sort this out properly. As Castellanos was led away in chains, his empire crumbling around him, Jake knelt down beside his son. You did good, Thomas. Your mama would be proud. Are we going to be a real family now? The boy asked hopefully. Jake looked around at the people who had become his family. Samuel, Elena, Molly, and her father Patterson. They'd all been brought together by tragedy, but they'd found something precious in each other. Yes, son, Jake said, pulling Thomas into a hug. We're going to be a real family, and we're going home. As they rode out of the canyon together, Jake realized that sometimes the greatest treasure isn't gold or silver. It's the people who stand by you when the world tries to tear you down. The loner wasn't alone anymore, and he never would be again. The Mackenzie family was finally complete, and their future stretched out before them like the endless Arizona sky, full of promise and hope. Hello, how are you? Did you enjoy the story? Like, share, comment on which city you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel to help us continue adding new amazing videos. Thank you very much, and come back often.